I guess it was about 2 years ago now, ran an event in the old building up the street, in which a day-long event in which a good cross-section of leading people on the technical side of climate science sat down with a number of experts in the foreign policy community to think seriously about this. The participation in that group was all North Americans, and we decided we needed to broaden the discourse, and so at the invitation of the government of Portugal, we ran a similar event in Lisbon last April, in which, in addition to North Americans, we had a fair cross-section of folks from across the EU, from Russia, China, India, and elsewhere around the world. And both of these had as their objective to try to get the foreign policy community at least aware of this issue and beginning to think about it. Now, I want to talk about two other things before I turn things over to John. First of all, the word geoengineering turns out to be sort of all-inclusive. I mean, to different people, it seems to mean all kinds of different stuff. The Royal Society in London did an assessment recently. Actually, the discussion in the back of that assessment on governance builds directly on the results of the two workshops we ran, because two of the key authors had been participants in both of those workshops. And they did a very useful thing. They introduced two words: solar radiation management for stuff that involves changing the albedo. And actually, in a piece that we published in Nature about a month and a half ago, Nature used some phrase about sunscreens or sunshades, which is perhaps maybe even better. And then all the other stuff was termed carbon dioxide removal. And among other things, on that side, I mean, you can actually build devices to scrub carbon dioxide directly out of the atmosphere and then sequester it, that is, put it deep underground in appropriate strata. Those sorts of processes are inherently slow. They could be as cheap as $100 to $200 a ton, so they're important. They set an upper bound on what the cost of controlling CO2 might be. But they're inherently slow, and you could do them within the confines of a particular nation. I don't view them as posing significant governance issues. On the other hand, the stuff that involves changing the albedo by, for example, putting very fine particles in the stratosphere, and we can talk a bit more about how you would go about doing that, could be done at relatively low cost, perhaps 1/100th or less the cost of abating emissions, and could be done by a single state operating within the confines of its national borders. I have a doctoral student right now who, in collaboration with groups at Oxford, is doing climate modeling, and while you can indeed reduce the average temperature of the planet, it's imperfect. And the effects are different in different parts of the world, and over time, for example, she has looked at how China and India's climate might evolve, and while they're both closer to today's climate than they would be, say, 80 or 100 years from now, over time, they, in a space of temperature and precip, they move away from each other. Last comment. I think that it would be a real problem. Well, I've published in several places recently an argument that says the time has come to mount a serious research program here. I'm not talking about an enormous amount of money. I'm just saying that to date there's been hardly any serious research. And for two reasons, we need to get serious and understand what could be done and what it might cost. The first reason is that there's some possibility that somebody else would do it, and then if we thought that was a terrible idea, because, for example, it does nothing about the ongoing acidification of the oceans, which will probably leave us without coral reefs by the end of this century, or any of a number of other impacts from rising CO2. If we thought it was a bad idea, we need to know enough to be able to mount coherent counter-arguments. And the other reason we need to do research is to, in the event that we have a climate disaster, we know what we're getting into if we suddenly decided we had to do this, if we had 1 billion people at risk around the world, for example. And so in the back few slides of this thing that I've passed out is an argument that says one of the things the climate science community should start doing fairly quickly is figuring out a space in which they could do field experiments without any sort of international oversight or review. I think we do stuff in the stratosphere all the time, of course, and so it's not as though the stratosphere is absolutely pristine. But you don't want to have people going off and doing things that involve large radiative forcings or go on for extended periods, or for that matter, provide lots of reactive surfaces that could result in significant ozone destruction. So I think one of the early requirements for the science community is to figure out, can you define a sort of space within which, as long as you're behaving inside that space, issues of governance are not a big deal, but doing anything outside that space requires some collective agreement that it would be appropriate to do that. And at that point, I'm going to stop and let John pick up.
Yeah, sure. Obviously, the questions then turn to governance issues, and that's what I'd like you to address. But a special question is, the UN negotiations have demonstrated the difficulty of getting a mutually acceptable agreement in place on the climate issues. I'm curious whether you would also address what this tells us about getting rules into place for geoengineering.
And maybe before John talks about that, I should say, I think that putting something in place quickly that made it really hard to do research on modest scales would be a disaster. But John and I may disagree.
Now, the role I've played is to try to anticipate what kind of rules would have to be applied if in this situation where, there is a technique that almost certainly would work, and it is not very expensive. So it's not as if there's a lot of uncertainty about what to do. There's at least one technique that would reduce, mimicking the volcanoes, would reduce average surface temperature on the order of 0.5 degree centigrade in a single year. But you'd have to keep doing it year after year. So I'm anticipating a situation in which the image of global consequence becomes globally distributed, and people start to get concerned about their equity in this. And although I agree that it is desirable and probably feasible to set a limited space such that you could say, well, field experiments in this relatively modest range are okay. I'm not sure how limited that can be, because at some point the world is going to insist on having a collective stake in this, almost certainly, because you're dealing with a global commons. The atmosphere, which everybody breathes, is a global commons, if anything is. And the basic rules say nobody gets to appropriate for personal or sovereign use, and everybody's equity has to be taken into account. So what I'm saying is that because you can imagine having very substantial global effects on the basis of very small initiatives, anticipate the need for global rules which do not currently exist. There's no direct legal structure dealing with this question, not surprisingly, because it's just coming on the horizon. Trying to be practical about it, what I say is that it'd be a very good idea for the National Academies of Sciences to have coordinating mechanisms among themselves to set guidelines for field experiments that might, in fact, set your limits and say, this is what you can do, and these are the limits you have to adhere to. And if you go beyond those limits, what are the guidelines for doing a globally sort of credible review as to the relative merits? And I presume that nobody's going to go off and try to do this with no research whatsoever. So there'll be a period of time in which we are dealing